There are moments in history when entire generations are called to answer questions they never asked. The Vietnam War was one of those moments. It didn't knock politely on America's door and wait for permission. It came like a storm brewing on a distant horizon, slowly building until it consumed everything in its path. Young men, barely old enough to understand what sacrifice truly meant, found themselves boarding planes and ships, bound for a land they couldn't find on a map 6 months earlier. They went because their country called. They went because their fathers had gone before them to different wars, different jungles, different kinds of hell. They went believing in something pure, something noble, something worth the risk. They believed in the mission. They believed in the righteousness of their cause. They believed that good men doing hard things could change the world. But belief, as they would learn in the most brutal classroom imaginable, is a fragile thing when placed against the reality of war. The jungle doesn't ask permission. It doesn't negotiate or compromise or show mercy to the unprepared. It takes everything, slowly, deliberately, silently. It strips away the layers of civilization that young men wear like armor, peeling back illusions until only the raw truth of survival remains. The heat alone was an enemy no training could prepare them for. It wasn't just hot. It was oppressive, crushing, a living weight that pressed down on shoulders already burdened with 70 pounds of equipment. The humidity turned the air into something thick and hostile, making every breath feel like drowning on dry land. Uniforms rotted from the inside out. Skin broke down in places the sun never touched. Boots fell apart, replaced and replaced again, until your feet became leather themselves. And through it all, the jungle watched with 1,000 hidden eyes, waiting patiently for weakness, for the inevitable moment when exhaustion would cloud judgment and death could slip through unseen. They arrived as boys shaped by John Wayne movies and stories their fathers told on quiet evenings. Tales of heroism in places called Normandy and Iwo Jima and the Bulge. They came with their heads full of glory and their hearts full of purpose, believing that war was something honorable men did for righteous causes. Young men arrived believing in mission and country, carried by the momentum of American confidence and the weight of expectation that had been building since their birth. But the war, patient and merciless, taught them something darker. It taught them that survival demands pieces of your soul. Not all at once, the war was too clever for that. It took small pieces first. The first time you saw a friend die, it took your innocence. The first time you killed, it took your peace. The first time you realized the mission didn't make sense, it took your faith. And piece by piece, day by day, patrol by patrol, it continued taking until you stood hollow, wondering what remained of the person who had stepped off that transport plane so full of purpose and belief. Stephen E. Ambrose, the great chronicler of American warriors, wrote with profound clarity about the men who stormed Omaha Beach and jumped into Normandy's darkness. He wrote that the soldiers of World War II knew what they were fighting for. They could point to Hitler, to the death camps, to the bombed cities of Europe and the burning wreckage of Pearl Harbor. The enemy wore a swastika. The objective was clear: unconditional surrender. Evil was identifiable, and good men knew exactly what needed to be done to defeat it. Liberation meant something tangible: cities freed, prisoners released, tyranny crushed beneath the boots of righteous armies. But in Vietnam, everything that had been clear became murky. The enemy was often invisible, moving through the jungle like smoke, impossible to pin down or predict. They wore no uniforms that distinguished them from farmers or fishermen. They fought from tunnels you couldn't see and villages that welcomed you by day and killed you by night. The mission was unclear, changing with each new strategy, from commanders who fought the war from air-conditioned offices in Saigon or Washington. And the moral ground beneath these young soldiers' boots proved unstable, shifting like the rice paddies that could swallow a man whole if he stepped wrong, leaving nothing but bubbles and the fading echo of a scream. Karl Marlantes understood this better than most. He went to Vietnam as a Marine Corps officer, a Yale graduate with everything to live for and every reason to believe in the nobility of his service. He came home with medals and memories that would haunt him for decades, truths that took him years to find the courage to speak. Marlantes observed something that cuts to the very bone of what Vietnam did to its warriors. He said, "We made young men into killers, then asked them to come home and be normal." Think about that for a moment. Consider the psychological violence of that transformation. You take an 18-year-old from Ohio or Texas or California, someone whose biggest concern 6 months ago was passing algebra and asking Sarah to prom. You put him through training designed to override millions of years of evolution that say killing another human being is wrong. You make him efficient at death. You reward speed and accuracy and ruthlessness. You turn empathy into a liability and hesitation into a fatal flaw. And then, when his tour ends, and he's done what you asked, when he's become exactly what you trained him to be, you put him on a plane and send him home with nothing but a manila envelope full of discharge papers and the unspoken expectation that he'll just flip a switch and become the boy he was before. This is the paradox that broke a generation. This is the impossible thing America asked of its young men, and then acted surprised when so many of them couldn't deliver. This is not a story of victory or defeat. Those terms belong to politicians and historians, who measure wars in territory gained and casualties inflicted, who draw lines on maps and declare winners based on whether flags still fly over contested ground. But the men who fought Vietnam know a deeper truth. They know that wars are not won or lost in presidential palaces or peace negotiations in Paris. Wars are won or lost in the hearts of the men who fight them, in the moments when belief either holds or shatters, in the impossible choices made in split seconds that echo through eternity. This is about the fall that happens inside a man when everything he believed collides with everything he sees. It's about the moment when training meets chaos, when doctrine meets reality, when the clean lines of right and wrong blur into shades of grey that no manual prepared you to navigate. It's about what happens to faith when tested beyond endurance, to hope when ground down by futility, to honor when asked to survive situations where honor seems like a luxury no one can afford. And it's about how some men, through courage or luck or sheer stubborn refusal to surrender their humanity, somehow survive that fall. While others, just as brave, just as worthy, never stop falling. They came home in body, but some essential part of them, the part that believed, that hoped, that trusted, remained forever in those jungles, in those villages, in those moments when everything fell apart and could never be put back together the same way again. They told you about the enemy in briefings that felt surreal, even as you sat through them. Intelligence officers with clean uniforms and confident voices stood before maps covered in red markings, explaining patrol routes and enemy positions with the certainty of men who had never walked those trails themselves. They trained you for combat in places that looked nothing like Vietnam, running you through mock villages in North Carolina or California, where the temperature was manageable and the threats were predictable, and nobody actually died when mistakes were made. But nobody, not the toughest drill instructor or the most experienced officer, could prepare you for the jungle itself. The jungle was an entity unto itself, a living, breathing adversary that killed more efficiently than any human enemy ever could. It wasn't neutral ground where armies met to contest territory. It was hostile in ways that defied every assumption about what warfare should look like. And it began its work on you, the moment you stepped off the helicopter into air so thick and hot, it felt like breathing through wet wool. The heat doesn't kill you fast. That would be a mercy, and the jungle offered no mercies to those who entered its domain. Instead, it dissolves you over weeks, over months, breaking down your body and mind through slow, persistent assault that never relents and never varies. It's not the dramatic heat of a forge or a fire, nothing that announces itself with spectacle. It's constant, oppressive, inescapable. 100 degrees in the shade when you can find shade, which is almost never because the mission keeps you moving through clearings and along trails where the sun beats down with focused malice. 100% humidity that turns your uniform into a second skin, soaked through within minutes and never quite drying even at night when temperatures drop just enough to let you shiver in your wet clothes. The heat melts resolve before the enemy ever fires a shot, saps strength from muscles that need every ounce to carry equipment designed by men who never considered what it means to hump 70 pounds through terrain that fights every step. Your body begins to break down in ways both visible and invisible. Weight drops off frames that can't afford to lose it. Skin develops rashes that never heal. Infections that spread because nothing stays clean in an environment where everything rots. Your mind starts playing tricks, exhaustion and heat combining to create hallucinations that blur the line between real threats and imagined ones, making you question whether that movement in the bush was an enemy soldier or just another fever dream produced by a brain pushed beyond its limits. You carry 70 pounds of gear in conditions that would hospitalize civilians within hours, and somehow you're expected to remain alert, combat effective, ready to fight at a moment's notice, even though every system in your body is screaming for rest that never comes. The weight breaks you down anatomically. Your boots rot from the inside out, leather and canvas succumbing to moisture and heat, and the constant stress of terrain that varies from razor-sharp volcanic rock to sucking mud that tries to pull your feet out from under you with every step. You get new boots, and they rot too, the cycle repeating until you wonder if your feet will ever feel normal again, or if the pain and the blisters and the infections have become your new permanent state. Your skin rots in places the sun never touches, places where sweat and friction and bacteria combine to create wounds that medical textbooks probably have names for, but that you just call jungle rot, because that's what everyone calls it. And through it all, through the physical breakdown and the mounting exhaustion and the 1,000 small failures of the body to cope with demands it was never designed to meet, the jungle watches. It watches with eyes you can't see from positions you can't predict. Through vegetation so dense that an entire battalion could hide 10 meters away and you'd never know until they decided to reveal themselves with fire and steel and the sudden chaos that turns the world into a nightmare. And then it happens. Without warning, without the courtesy of building tension or dramatic music or any of the things that movies teach you to expect. It just happens. First contact. The phrase sounds almost clinical, like something from a report or a training manual, but there's nothing clinical about the reality of it. One moment you're walking patrol, hot and tired, and thinking about nothing more complex than putting one foot in front of the other and maybe getting back to base before dark. The next moment, the world explodes into violence so sudden and overwhelming that your brain takes precious seconds to catch up with what your body already knows. The jungle erupts with sound that seems to come from everywhere at once. AK-47s have a distinctive crack that's different from M16s, higher pitched and faster. And in that first instant, your mind catalogues the sound, even as your body is already moving, dropping, seeking cover that doesn't exist in terrain that offers nothing but inadequate trees and shallow depressions that feel like graves even before anyone dies in them. First firefight. 60 seconds. That's all it takes. 60 seconds that rewire a lifetime, that take everything you thought you knew about yourself and burn it down to ash and rebuild something new from the smoking remains. Where training becomes instinct, muscle memory taking over because conscious thought is too slow for combat, too cluttered with fear and confusion and the overwhelming sensory assault of battle. Where instinct becomes survival, that most basic of all drives, the one that existed before civilization and will exist after. The one that strips away every layer of culture and education and identity until all that remains is the desperate, howling need to live through the next second, and then the next, and then the next. Where survival becomes the only thought your mind can hold. Everything else, home, family, future, the person you were 5 minutes ago, compressed into a singularity of now, of breath, of the trigger under your finger, and the enemy in your sights, and staying alive long enough to see what comes after. The drill instructor's voice in your head disappears. That commanding bark that had seemed so permanent during training, so much a part of your internal landscape that you thought it would always be there to guide you. But in the chaos of actual combat, it fades like morning mist, irrelevant in the face of reality that bears no resemblance to the controlled exercises of boot camp. Your mother's prayers fade to static, those words she whispered to you at the airport before you deployed. Promises that God would protect you and bring you home safe, reduced to background noise that your brain no longer has the capacity to process. There's only this, only the target, visible for just a moment through the smoke and the vegetation, a shape more than a person, something to be engaged rather than understood. Only the trigger, that small piece of metal that transforms intention into action, that stands between you and death, or your squad, and annihilation. Only the man next to you, whose life suddenly matters more than your own, whose survival becomes the mission more important than any objective marked on a map. And only staying alive, that simple desperate goal that encompasses everything and nothing, that becomes both the means and the end, the question and the answer. The gunfire continues for eternity and ends in seconds, both truths somehow coexisting in a mind that has lost all reliable sense of time. And then comes the aftermath, that strange suspended moment when the shooting stops but the war hasn't ended, when your ears ring so loud you can barely hear the shouted commands, and your hands shake so badly you need 3 tries to light a cigarette. You look around at faces that mirror your own shock, eyes too wide and breathing too fast. Everyone doing the same rapid calculation of who's still here and who's not, whose voice you heard screaming for a medic and whether help reached them in time. And then comes the realization, the one that hits harder than bullets ever could, the understanding that changes everything about how you see this war and your place in it. The enemy knows this terrain. He wasn't inserted here by helicopter yesterday or last week. He was born in it, raised in it, learned to walk on these trails before he learned to read. He owns the darkness that falls like a curtain every night, moving through it with the confidence of a man in his own home, while you stumble and guess and hope your night vision is good enough to spot threats before they spot you. He owns the paths you can't see, the ones that don't appear on any map but that lead to every ambush site and supply cache and safe house in his operational area. And he's already decided he's willing to die, not in some abstract philosophical sense, but in the concrete, immediate way of a man who has made peace with his mortality and turned it into a weapon more powerful than any rifle or grenade. He will trade his life for yours without hesitation, and that certainty, that absolute commitment, is more terrifying than any amount of firepower, because it means he cannot be deterred by fear or threatened by death or convinced to value his survival over his mission. Radio crackle breaks through the ringing in your ears, that distinctive squelch and hiss that precedes every transmission, and you hear words that become the most important in your vocabulary. Dust off inbound. 2 mics. The medevac helicopter is coming. We'll be here in 2 minutes. And suddenly, those 120 seconds stretch out like hours as you do everything possible to keep wounded men alive long enough for help to arrive. Incoming medevac. The sound builds from nothing, from a whisper to a rumble to the beautiful thundering roar of rotors beating the air, and you've never heard anything more perfect in your life. Blood mixing with monsoon rain, turning the ground beneath wounded men into red mud that will stain your hands and your uniform and your memory long after any amount of washing has removed the physical traces. This is the moment you understand, when all the abstractions of training and all the rhetoric of briefings finally crystallize into truth so clear it hurts. War isn't about winning ground. It's not about body counts or strategic hamlets or pacification programs, or any of the metrics that commanders use to brief generals, who brief politicians, who brief the American people. It's about bringing your brothers home alive. It's about keeping the men beside you breathing and walking and whole enough to board that helicopter when it comes. Every decision, every action, every risk taken or refused comes down to that single overwhelming imperative. Get your people out. Get them home. Keep them alive one more day, one more patrol, one more firefight, until their tour ends, and they can board that freedom bird back to the world they left behind. But here's the psychological fracture that splits you in two, that creates a crack in your sense of purpose that will never fully heal, no matter how much time passes or how far you get from this place. What happens when doing your duty means watching friends die for objectives abandoned the next day? You take a hill at terrible cost, losing men whose names you'll carry forever, whose faces will appear in dreams for decades. You dig in, establish positions, call it secure, and report mission accomplished to higher headquarters. And then, sometimes within hours, certainly within days, you get orders to abandon it, to walk away from ground that was purchased with blood, and leave it to an enemy who will reoccupy it the moment you're gone, making the entire battle pointless in retrospect. What happens when sacrifice has no meaning? When the coin of courage buys nothing but more combat and more casualties and more meaningless objectives that will be taken and abandoned in an endless cycle that seems designed to break spirits rather than win wars? What happens when you watch good men give everything for missions that commanders don't value enough to hold, for strategic goals that shift with political winds blowing from Washington? This is when the fall begins, not in the moment of combat, but in the moment after. When you have time to think about what just happened and realize it didn't matter, that you'll do it again tomorrow and the day after, and it still won't matter. That the war has become a machine that consumes lives without purpose and spits out broken men without apology. This is when something inside starts to crack. When faith in the mission begins to erode, and all that keeps you going is faith in the men beside you. Because if you can't believe in the why, you have to believe in the who. Or else nothing makes sense, and madness waits just beyond the next firefight. Firebase Charlie. The name means nothing to anyone who wasn't there. Just another set of grid coordinates on maps that have long since been folded away and forgotten, filed in archives that nobody consults anymore because the war they documented ended in ways that make people uncomfortable to remember. It was a collection of sandbags and bunkers and concertina wire carved out of hostile territory. So small, you could walk its perimeter in 5 minutes if you weren't worried about snipers. So isolated that help was always too far away to matter when things went bad. The official designation gave it a veneer of permanence and importance, as if naming something made it significant. As if the military bureaucracy's need to categorize every position somehow transformed raw earth and desperation into something that mattered in the grand strategic picture. But for the men who held that ground, who filled those sandbags and pulled those watches and bled into that red clay soil, Firebase Charlie was everything. It wasn't a place on a map or a dot in a briefing slide. It was home, in the only sense that word could have meaning in Vietnam. The small circle of earth where you could almost relax, where the odds of dying decreased from certain to merely probable, where the men around you became more real than family, because they were present in ways that mothers and girlfriends and brothers back in the world could never be. In Vietnam, your squad wasn't your unit in any conventional military sense. It wasn't an administrative assignment or an organizational chart position, something that could be changed with transfer orders or redeployment schedules. It was your religion, the faith you held when all other faiths had failed or been proven false by the grinding reality of a war that made mockery of every ideal you'd brought with you. It was your family, more immediate and essential than blood relations separated by 10,000 miles, and a psychological distance that no letter could bridge. It was your only truth in a world of lies, the single constant in an environment where everything else, the mission, the enemy, the terrain, your own identity, shifted and changed and proved unreliable. Back in the world, people went to church on Sundays and found meaning in rituals that connected them to something larger than themselves. Here the rituals were different, but served the same fundamental human need. You found meaning in the small ceremonies that bound squad members together, in the unspoken rules and shared experiences that created something approaching order in chaos, in the absolute certainty that these men would die for you and you would die for them because that covenant was the only thing that made survival possible and death bearable. Shared sea rations at 0300, the worst shift, the dead hours when exhaustion weighs heaviest and the mind plays tricks and staying alert feels like an act of will that requires constant renewal. You sit in a fighting position with dirt walls that wouldn't stop a determined attack for more than seconds, eating food that all tastes the same regardless of what the label claims, mechanically spooning mystery meat or beans or some gelatinous substance into your mouth, not because you're hungry, but because the body needs fuel, and hunger is something you learned to ignore weeks ago. The darkness around you is absolute, the kind of black that exists only in places without electric lights or the ambient glow of civilization. And in that darkness, the men beside you become known through sound and smell and the simple fact of presence. You share the rations, not because military protocol requires it, but because the act of sharing creates connection, transforms solitary survival into collective existence, reminds you that you're still human in an environment designed to reduce humanity to its most basic components. And you talk when talking feels safe enough. Conversations that would horrify people back home, but here serve as pressure valves for stress that has nowhere else to go. Dark humor about death. Jokes that cross every line of decency and taste, because decency and taste are luxuries that belong to a world you no longer inhabit. Someone makes a crack about getting killed in a stupid way, about taking a round while squatting in the latrine or getting fragged by your own artillery. And everyone laughs because the alternative to laughing is thinking too hard about how likely those scenarios actually are. The humor isn't cruelty or callousness, though from the outside it might look like both. It's a coping mechanism refined by generations of warriors who learned that you can't carry the full weight of mortality every moment of every day without breaking. That sometimes you have to make death small and absurd and manageable through mockery before it makes you small through fear. And beneath the jokes, unspoken but absolutely present, lies the sacred promise that binds squad members more tightly than any oath administered by officers or any contract signed with the government. I won't let you die alone. 4 words that contain everything that matters, that transform war from an existential nightmare into something bearable through the simple assertion of human connection. You might die, probably will die if the odds play out over enough patrols and enough contact, but you won't die alone in the dark with nobody knowing or caring that you're gone. Someone will be there. Someone will hold your hand or apply pressure to wounds that can't be saved, or simply bear witness to your last moments so that you don't disappear from the universe unnoticed. This promise, more than any strategic objective or tactical plan, is what keeps men fighting when every rational calculation says to quit. The tribal bond that transcends ideology, that makes nonsense of every division and category that seemed so important back in the world, where people sorted themselves by race and class and education and 1,000 other markers of status and belonging. Black, white, Latino, Asian, it doesn't matter when the mortars fall. When the high explosive comes arcing down from positions you can't see to land with random mathematical precision that doesn't care about skin color or accent or which side of the tracks you grew up on. Rich, poor, college graduate, high school dropout, all those distinctions that defined so much of American life in the 1960s dissolve under fire until what remains is simply this: men who need each other to survive. The tribal bond forms faster and deeper than any relationship in civilian life because the stakes are absolute and the pretense is impossible. You can't fake courage under fire. You can't pretend competence when lives depend on your actions. Everything that matters becomes visible within days, sometimes hours. And the squad sorts itself not by the hierarchies imported from home, but by the only hierarchy that functions in combat, who can be trusted when everything falls apart. The bonds formed under these conditions have a purity that peacetime relationships rarely achieve, a clarity born of shared mortal danger that strips away all the social performance and calculated positioning that characterizes normal human interaction. These men see you at your worst and your best, see you crying and laughing and terrified and triumphant, see everything you are without filter or protection, and choose to stand with you anyway. That choice, renewed every day simply by showing up and doing the job, creates connection that many veterans will later say was the deepest they ever experienced, the standard against which all subsequent relationships are measured and often found wanting. Night watch rotation, 2-hour shifts that divide the darkness into manageable segments while ensuring that someone is always alert, always scanning the perimeter, always ready to sound the alarm that might save everyone or die trying. 2 hours where you hold another man's life in your exhausted vigilance, where your attention or lack thereof directly determines whether your brothers wake up to see morning or die in their sleep without ever knowing what killed them. You fight sleep with every tool available, with caffeine and nicotine and pain and fear and the sheer stubborn refusal to be the man who failed, who let his eyes close for just a moment and woke to find his friends dead because he couldn't stay awake. You fight the hallucinations that come with extreme fatigue, the shadows that move in ways shadows shouldn't move, the sounds that might be enemy soldiers or might be animals or might be nothing at all, but that demand investigation, because the one time you assume it's nothing could be the time that assumption kills everyone. You fight the temptation to close your eyes for just 1 second, just long enough to rest them, because that second turns into 5, and 5 turns into a minute, and before you know it, you're jerking awake in panic, unsure how long you were out, and terrified that something happened while you slept. The responsibility is crushing in its simplicity. Stay awake, watch, keep your brothers alive, and knowing that tomorrow night, or the night after, your life will rest in someone else's hands while you sleep. Trusting them with the same absolute faith they placed in you creates reciprocal obligation that binds men together more effectively than any contract or command. But here's the moral paradox nobody talks about, nobody wants to admit. The uncomfortable truth that veterans carry in silence because speaking it aloud makes people recoil and judge and fail to understand what war demands of those who fight it. Loving your brothers means becoming efficient at killing. The better you are at your job, the faster your reflexes, the more accurate your fire, the more ruthless your decisions, the higher the chance your squad survives to see the end of their tour. Love in this context doesn't look like anything civilians would recognize as love. It looks like violence executed with precision. It looks like learning to kill without hesitation, without doubt, without the luxury of considering the humanity of the enemy, because that consideration creates the split-second delay that gets your friends killed. The moral paradox tears at something essential in the human psyche, creates a wound that never fully heals because it requires holding 2 contradictory truths simultaneously. You love these men with an intensity that transcends anything you felt before, and that love makes you into someone capable of acts that would have horrified the person you were before the war. And that efficiency, that cold mechanical precision with which you learn to end lives, it haunts you forever. Not during the war, necessarily, when it serves a purpose and saves lives and can be justified by the immediate arithmetic of survival. But after, when you're back in the world and the reflexes remain, but the justification is gone, when you realize that the efficiency you developed can't be turned off like a switch, and that some part of you will always be that person, efficient at death, capable of violence that should be foreign to your nature but has become inextricable from your identity. When one man falls, the whole squad bleeds, an organic truth that makes squad cohesion both the greatest strength and the deepest vulnerability of combat units. The grief is immediate and absolute, not something that waits for memorial services or the proper time and place to process emotion. It hits the moment you see him go down, see the way his body moves wrong or stops moving at all. And that grief is a physical thing that lives in your chest and your throat and makes breathing difficult and thinking almost impossible. But in combat, grief is a luxury you can't afford, so it becomes something else. Grief becomes fuel, the raw energy that pushes you forward when rational thought would counsel retreat, that makes you willing to take risks you wouldn't normally take because the man who fell was your brother, and his death demands answer. Rage becomes focus, that white-hot anger that could easily become chaotic and destructive, but instead narrows to a point, sharpens into something useful, transforms emotion into precision. You're not thinking about the broader strategic picture or the moral implications or anything beyond the immediate need to make the enemy pay for what they took. And humanity, that complex bundle of empathy and restraint and consideration that defines civilized behavior, becomes optional. Not because you want it to, not because you've decided to abandon your values, but because, in that moment, survival and revenge and protecting the men still alive take precedence over every other consideration. You become capable of things that would be unthinkable in any other context, and later, much later, when there's time to think, you'll have to find a way to live with the memory of who you became and what you did. But in the moment, when one of your brothers is dead and others are still in danger, humanity becomes something you can't afford, a weight you set aside intending to pick it back up later, not knowing that some weights, once set down, are never quite the same when you try to lift them again. November 7. The grid, not the date, though the distinction matters less as time passes and both kinds of coordinates blur into the general fog of memory that veterans carry from Vietnam. These were meaningless coordinates to anyone not present. Just two syllables and a number that could have indicated any square kilometer of jungle in a country covered with squares that all looked essentially the same from the air and felt equally hostile from the ground. But for the men who walked into that grid square on a morning that started like every other morning, hot and tense and routine in the way that only constant danger can make routine, those coordinates would become seared into memory with the permanence of trauma. Years later, decades later, men who couldn't remember what they had for breakfast, or the names of co-workers, or the details of their children's graduations, would remember November 7 with perfect clarity, would be able to describe the exact placement of trees and the angle of the trail, and the way the light filtered through the canopy in those last moments before everything went to hell. The mind does this with traumatic events, stamps them into permanent record with a fidelity that normal memories never achieve, ensures that you can never fully escape the moments that changed you most profoundly. Intelligence said the trail was clear. ESA2, the intelligence section, delivered their assessment with the confidence that comes from looking at maps and reading reports and analyzing patterns from the safety of headquarters, where the worst danger is paperwork and bad coffee. They swore on it, assured the patrol leader that enemy activity in the area had been minimal, that the trail represented the safest route to the objective, that all available information suggested an uneventful patrol. Clean route. No enemy activity reported. The words went into the briefing log and the patrol order and the official record that would later be reviewed by people trying to understand what went wrong. But the words were lies, or at least represented such a profound misunderstanding of ground truth that they might as well have been lies. Intelligence was wrong. Not maliciously, not through negligence necessarily, but wrong in the way that intelligence was always wrong, because the people generating it were working from information that was always old and often unreliable and filtered through layers of interpretation that stripped out context and nuance until what remained bore only passing resemblance to reality. The enemy didn't file movement reports or announce his intentions or make himself visible to aerial reconnaissance. He moved in darkness and hid in daylight and only revealed himself when he chose to, which meant that intelligence was less a science than a guess dressed up in official language and classified markings. Intel was always wrong. This wasn't cynicism or defeatism, just the accumulated wisdom of men who had learned through bitter experience that the gap between what headquarters believed and what existed on the ground was often measured in lives. You went on patrol knowing that the reassuring words in the briefing meant nothing, that the trail marked safe could hide an ambush, that the village reported friendly could be staging area for the enemy, that every step carried risk regardless of what the intelligence summary claimed. This created a psychological burden that compounded the physical ones, meant you could never fully relax even when doing everything right. Because doing everything right according to plan offered no protection when the plan was based on faulty assumptions. You learned to trust your instincts over intelligence reports, to pay attention to the small signs that something was wrong, even when official assessment said otherwise, to understand that survival often depended on assuming the worst, and being pleasantly surprised rather than hoping for the best and dying when hope proved unfounded. Patrol moved in standard formation, through jungle that looked no different from hundreds of other patrols. Vegetation thick enough to limit visibility, but not so dense that movement became impossible. Heat oppressive but manageable. The day wearing on toward the time when patrols normally turned back toward base because being out after dark was suicide. Pointman held up his fist in the universal signal that meant halt, stop, something's wrong. His instincts, sharpened by months of walking ahead of everyone else with his life, depending on noticing what didn't belong, picked up something that made the hair on his neck stand up, even if he couldn't articulate exactly what it was. Maybe the birds had gone silent. Maybe the vegetation looked disturbed in ways that suggested recent passage. Maybe it was nothing more than the feeling that comes from being watched, that primitive awareness that predates language and logic, and represents the accumulated survival instinct of millions of years of evolution. The squad froze, each man scanning his sector, breathing shallow, fingers moving to weapons, adrenaline starting to flood systems in preparation for fight or flight. The tension that had been background noise suddenly became foreground, crystallized into certainty that something was about to happen, even if nobody knew exactly what or when. The L-shaped ambush is the Viet Cong's specialty, a tactical masterpiece when executed correctly that turns terrain into weapon and surprise into massacre. You set it right by positioning forces along two sides of a trail to create intersecting fields of fire, by choosing ground that funnels the enemy into a kill zone with no escape routes, by waiting with the patience that comes from knowing that this is your terrain and your war, and that you can afford to wait hours or days for the perfect moment. You spring it right by holding fire until the enemy is fully committed, until they're in the zone where every weapon can hit them, and they can't retreat without exposing themselves to fire from multiple directions, until that perfect moment when surprise and violence of action combine to create chaos that overwhelms training and breaks units before they can organize effective response. Set it right, spring it right, and the kill zone becomes a death trap from which escape is more luck than skill. A box of interlocking fire that makes every direction equally lethal and reduces tactical options to the simple, desperate calculus of survive the next second. The jungle erupted. There's no other word that captures the sudden totality of violence, the way the world transformed in an instant from tense silence to absolute chaos. 30 seconds, where the world explodes and time fractures into pure survival instinct, where the normal flow of experience breaks down into disconnected moments that the mind captures with terrible clarity, but can't quite sequence into coherent narrative. Sound becomes physical, becomes something you feel in your chest and your bones as much as hear with your ears. Muzzle flashes appear from positions you hadn't seen despite looking directly at them moments before, revealing how perfectly the enemy had concealed himself in terrain he knew intimately. Return fire is automatic, muscle memory taking over before conscious thought can catch up, training asserting itself through the shock and the fear and the overwhelming sensory assault. Men are moving and shooting and shouting and dying all at once, compressed into seconds that feel like hours, while simultaneously feeling like no time at all. And the only thing keeping anyone alive is the training that turned response into reflex and the luck that determines which bullets find targets and which pass harmlessly through empty space. The squad leader took multiple hits before anyone even registered he was down, his body jerking with impact and collapsing in the boneless way that means dead before hitting ground, or so close to dead that the distinction doesn't matter. He was the center, the man who made decisions and gave orders and represented whatever fragile structure held the squad together as a functioning unit rather than a collection of individuals. Radio destroyed in the same burst that killed the RTO, the radio operator who carried communications gear that suddenly became the most important thing in the world, because without it, there's no calling for support. No coordination with other units, no way to tell anyone what's happening or where you are, or that you need help desperately. Options evaporating like smoke in the rain, each second revealing new limitations as the tactical situation degrades from bad to catastrophic. The careful plans made in briefings mean nothing now. The standard operating procedures and battle drills, practiced until they became automatic encounter situations they never quite covered. Moments when the manual doesn't have answers and improvisation is all that remains. Leadership isn't chosen in these moments. Not here, not now, when there's no time for votes or discussions or careful consideration of who's best qualified. It's forced on whoever's left standing, whoever's willing to move when everyone else freezes. Whoever can push through the fear and the shock and the voice screaming in their head to run and instead start giving orders that might save lives or might get everyone killed, but represent the only alternative to paralysis. A young corporal, barely 23, with less time in country than half the squad and no expectation that he'd ever be in charge of anything more important than his own survival, finds himself making decisions that will determine who lives and who dies. He's frozen for 1 second, maybe 2, the weight of responsibility hitting like physical force. And in that second, he can feel the squad starting to fragment, starting to lose cohesion as each man's individual survival instinct threatens to override collective action. And then he moves, starts pointing and ordering and directing fire, voice cracking with fear and adrenaline, but loud enough to be heard over the chaos. And the squad responds, because humans are tribal creatures who need hierarchy and structure even in chaos, especially in chaos. And any leadership is better than none when everything's falling apart. The medic worked with efficiency born of grim experience, and moving through trauma procedures practiced so many times, they've become automatic even as his mind screams at the reality of performing them on friends rather than training dummies. The terrible mathematics of triage, decisions that should be made by doctors in hospitals with time and resources and the luxury of trying to save everyone, compressed into seconds where trying to save everyone means saving no one. Save the ones you can. The ones with wounds that might be survivable if treated immediately, if bleeding can be controlled and airways maintained and shock prevented. Leave the ones you can't, the ones too far gone or too badly hit or in positions too exposed to reach without dying yourself. Live with it later. 3 words that sound simple until you try to actually do them, until you try to carry the memory of men you left behind, not because you didn't care, but because the mathematics of survival demanded choices that carve pieces out of your soul. This is the moment that changes you forever. The moment when you stop being the person you were and become someone else, someone harder, someone capable of making decisions that violate every instinct toward compassion and care because survival demands it. Something dies in your eyes during these moments. Some innocence or faith or belief in your own goodness that you didn't even know you carried until it was gone. The young corporal, Now functionally in command through circumstance rather than qualification. Gets on the damaged radio that barely works, but works enough, and calls coordinates for fire mission. Artillery, the king of battle, the long-range killer that can drop high explosive from miles away with devastating accuracy when called correctly. Danger close, the military term for artillery fire that lands within 600 meters of friendly forces, close enough that friendly casualties from your own guns become a real possibility. I say again, danger close. The repetition isn't for emphasis, but for confirmation, ensuring that the Fire Direction Center understands that they're being asked to shoot shells that could kill the people asking for them, that this isn't an error in coordinate transmission, but a desperate measure justified only by circumstances that make death from any direction preferable to certain death from the enemy. 50 meters from your own position, close enough to feel the shockwave in your chest cavity, close enough that fragments from the shells can tear through anyone not behind hard cover, close enough to die from your own fire support if the guns are off by even small margins, or if the shells land slightly wrong, or if luck simply abandons you at the worst possible moment. The willingness to risk your own life to save your brothers, to call fire on your own position and trust that somehow you'll survive while the enemy won't. To accept that you might die by American artillery in order to prevent certain death by enemy fire. This defines who you become, crystallizes in one radio call everything that matters about combat and brotherhood and the willingness to make impossible choices when all the good options have been exhausted. Artillery impacts with force that belongs in different categories, from small arms fire, shells that weigh nearly 100 pounds, traveling at speeds that make them invisible until they detonate, transforming potential energy into expanding gas, and flying steel that kills by overpressure and fragmentation in radius measured in meters. The ground shakes. The air becomes concussion. The sound is beyond sound, becomes physical force that makes ears bleed and thoughts scatter. And when it's over, when the last shell has impacted and the smoke begins to clear, there's a moment of eerie quiet where nobody quite believes they're still alive, still intact, still capable of movement. Survivors check each other with hands that shake from adrenaline and relief and residual fear, loading wounded onto improvised litters made from ponchos and rifles, doing quick counts to determine who made it and who didn't, who's ambulatory and who needs immediate evacuation, and who's beyond help. And then comes the sound that makes everything else worthwhile, that transforms the nightmare of the last minutes into something bearable through the promise of rescue. Distant helicopters growing louder, the distinctive whop, whop, whop of Huey rotors that announces salvation is inbound. The most beautiful sound on earth, more beautiful than music or laughter or any sound from the world before the war. Rotors cutting through gunfire, coming for you despite the dangers, despite the hot landing zone and the enemy still in the area, and all the excellent reasons to abort the mission and leave you to extract on foot. The helicopter crew coming anyway because that's what they do, because leaving men behind isn't acceptable, because the covenant between those who fly and those who walk says that extraction happens regardless of circumstances. Coming for you when you had started to believe that maybe this time help wouldn't arrive. Maybe this time you'd used up all your luck and all that remained was dying in this anonymous piece of jungle, whose coordinates you'd never forget and whose name meant nothing to anyone who wasn't here. The helicopter landed under fire. Dr. Gunners laying down suppressive fire with M60s that sound different from rifles, deeper and more sustained, painting arcs of tracers that mark where death is going, and hopefully keeping enemy heads down long enough for the wounded to be loaded. Every second on the ground is an eternity. Every moment the helicopter sits stationary is another opportunity for enemy fire to find something vital, to hit the pilot or the engine or the fuel tank and turn salvation into shared catastrophe. Wounded being loaded with speed that would be rough in any other context, but here represents the difference between getting out alive or not getting out at all. hands grabbing and lifting and shoving men aboard with efficiency born of practice and urgency. The helicopter pulled away, rotors screaming as the pilot demanded maximum power. Rising through the canopy with wounded men collapsed inside, and survivors hanging on and everyone staring at nothing. Minds still processing what just happened while bodies shake with delayed reaction. You survived November 7. Your body did anyway, still breathing and bleeding and capable of movement. The rest of you, the parts that aren't captured by simple biological function, still there in that kill zone, still making those choices, still watching men die and calling fire danger close and becoming someone you didn't recognize. Forever trapped in those 30 seconds that rewrote everything about who you are and who you thought you could be. The Viet Cong learned something that the French never understood during their decade of failure in Indochina, something that would prove more devastating to American forces than any conventional military strategy could achieve. They learned that you don't have to win firefights if you can make the earth itself hostile, if you can transform every step of every patrol into a potential death sentence, if you can weaponize the very ground that foreign soldiers must walk to accomplish their mission. This understanding represented a fundamental shift in how warfare could be conducted, a recognition that psychological damage often matters more than physical casualties, that an enemy consumed by paranoia and fear is already halfway to defeat before the first shot is fired. The French had superior firepower and air support, and all the technological advantages that industrialized nations bring to war. And they lost anyway, because they never adapted to an enemy who refused to fight on their terms, who turned the countryside into an endless maze of hidden threats that ground down morale and courage through sheer persistent terror. Punji stakes, tripwires, buried artillery shells, grenades in ammo caches, explosives under trails that had been safe yesterday but became deadly overnight through the patient work of an enemy who owned the darkness and used it to remake the battlefield while Americans slept. The Viet Cong didn't just fight you in the conventional sense of opposing armies meeting in battle. They made every step a potential death, every movement through terrain a gamble where the odds were never quite calculable because you didn't know where the threats were or how many existed or whether the trail you walked last week had been seeded with death in the days since. Every tree became a possible sniper position, every thick patch of vegetation a potential ambush site, every village a place that might be friendly or hostile or both, depending on time of day and which armed group had visited most recently. Every child a potential threat, not because children were inherently dangerous, but because the war had twisted everything so thoroughly that innocence itself became suspect, because sometimes children were used as spotters or even as weapons themselves. And the inability to distinguish between genuine innocence and weaponized innocence created moral paralysis that ate at souls in ways that combat never could. Point man walks ahead of the squad. Separation measured in meters that represent the margin between individual death and collective survival. The loneliest job in warfare, a position that combines maximum responsibility with maximum vulnerability, where your sole purpose is to find the threats before they find you, and accept that finding them often means triggering them, means your body absorbs the blast, or the stakes, or the explosion that would otherwise hit the men behind you. Every step is a potential last step, each placement of foot requiring decision and attention that exhausts the mind faster than the body, because you can't walk naturally when walking naturally might kill you. You move slowly when every instinct screams to move fast, to get through the dangerous areas quickly rather than lingering in them. But speed means inattention, and inattention means death. So you override instinct and creep forward at a pace that feels suicidal in its deliberation. Every movement is scrutinized by eyes behind you, by men whose lives depend on your ability to spot what doesn't belong. And the weight of that responsibility compounds the fear until they become inseparable, until you're no longer sure whether the shaking in your hands comes from terror of dying or terror of failing your brothers. Hypervigilance, burning out your nervous system one step at a time. The constant state of maximum alertness that human beings weren't designed to maintain for hours, much less for days or weeks or the months of a combat tour. Your eyes scan continuously, never resting, never allowing focus to soften into the kind of relaxed attention that suffices in safe environments. You look for disturbed earth, for soil that's been moved recently and then attempted to be camouflaged, for patterns that don't quite match the surrounding terrain. Bent grass, blades pushed down in directions that wine doesn't explain, or in patterns too regular to be natural. Unnatural arrangements of stones that might mark a cache, or might indicate a tripwire anchor point. Wire glinting in sunlight, metal that doesn't belong in an environment of vegetation and earth. That momentary flash of reflection that might be the only warning before your next step pulls a pin, or completes a circuit, or releases tension that sends pungy stakes through your legs. The absence of sound where sound should be. The moments when birds go silent or insects stop their constant background noise. Nature's warning system that predators have entered the area even if those predators are invisible to human senses. Your life depends on noticing what's wrong, on developing the kind of situational awareness that borders on paranormal, that makes you sensitive to details. Your conscious mind doesn't even register until instinct makes you freeze, and only then does analysis catch up to explain why. What doesn't belong? What changed since the last patrol through this area? What looks staged rather than natural? Your brain becomes a comparison engine running constantly, matching current observations against memories of how things should look, flagging discrepancies that might be nothing or might be everything. The mental load is crushing, the attention required unsustainable. And yet you sustain it anyway, because the alternative is dying or watching your friends die. And so you push past what should be limits of human cognition, and discover that when survival demands it, those limits can be exceeded at least temporarily, though the cost of exceeding them compounds with every hour and every day, until something in your psychology breaks under the strain. And when you hear that click, that small mechanical sound that shouldn't exist in nature, that noise of metal on metal or the snap of a tripwire going taut, time doesn't slow the way movies suggest, but rather fractures into crystalline clarity, where you perceive everything with terrible precision while being utterly unable to change what happens next. The sound means you've triggered something, means that in the next fraction of a second physics will take over, an explosive will detonate, or stakes will release, or some mechanism of death will activate. And there's nothing you can do except perhaps shout a warning to those behind you if your vocal cords respond faster than the explosion. Some men freeze in that instant, minds unable to process the reality that they're about to die or be horribly maimed. Some men try to run, instinct overriding knowledge that you can't outrun an explosion that's already been triggered. And some men, the ones who've survived long enough to develop reflexes for situations that shouldn't have reflexes, drop and curl and try to minimize their profile in the microseconds available before impact. And sometimes that saves them, and sometimes it doesn't, because luck is as important as skill when it comes to booby traps. The explosion tears through the morning or the afternoon or whatever time it is, and time itself becomes irrelevant in the face of sudden violence that transforms human bodies into damaged things requiring immediate intervention to have any chance of survival. The aftermath brings chaos of a different kind from firefights. Panic that comes from invisible threats rather than visible enemies, from knowing that there might be more traps in the immediate area, and that rushing to help the wounded might trigger secondary devices placed specifically to kill the rescuers. Soldiers rush forward anyway, screaming for the medic, screaming names, screaming without words, because sound is the only outlet for horror and rage and the desperate need to do something even when there's nothing useful to be done. The psychological terrorism of invisible warfare, of an enemy who kills without revealing himself, who inflicts casualties without offering targets for retaliation, who makes the act of walking or touching or moving through terrain into games of Russian roulette where the odds are unknown and the consequences. Absolute paranoia becomes survival. When the environment itself cannot be trusted, when the distinction between caution and mental illness blurs until they become indistinguishable. You start seeing threats everywhere because threats are everywhere. Start assuming that everything is dangerous until proven otherwise, because the inverse assumption gets people killed. Trust becomes impossible because trust requires a baseline belief in the safety of your environment. And that baseline doesn't exist when the ground beneath your feet might explode, and the vegetation around you might hide enemies, and the people in villages might smile at you while planning your death. Peace, the internal psychological state of feeling safe and relaxed and able to lower defenses, becomes a foreign concept you barely remember. Something from a previous life that feels more like a dream than a memory. You can't afford peace. Peace makes you slow. Peace makes you careless. Peace will get you killed. And so you maintain constant readiness, constant suspicion, constant activation of stress responses that human bodies are designed to experience in brief bursts during genuine emergencies, but that you're forcing to run continuously, burning through psychological and physiological reserves that won't regenerate while you're still in theater. Losing a man to a trap hits different from losing him in a firefight, creates a different quality of grief that's somehow worse, despite the outcome being equally final. There's no firefight, no moment of mutual combat where both sides are trying to kill each other and death at least happens in context that soldiers understand. No heroics, no last stand or valiant effort or dramatic final moments that can be shaped into narrative that gives meaning to loss. Just sudden absence. A man who was walking and talking and alive one moment and then isn't. Reduced to screaming agony or silent death by a weapon that was placed hours or days ago by an enemy who never saw his victim and will never know whether his trap succeeded. Senseless mathematics. The pure randomness of which step lands on the trigger, which path happens to intersect with the hidden threat, which man in the patrol order happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong instant. You can't even find comfort in believing that the dead man made a mistake, that if he'd been more careful or more skilled, he'd still be alive. Because often there was no mistake to make, no way to detect the threat before triggering it. Nothing that anyone could have done differently that would have changed the outcome. The arbitrariness of it, the sheer random chance that determines who lives and who dies, corrodes faith in any kind of cosmic justice or divine protection or the belief that good men survive while bad men don't. Sometimes good men die for no reason other than taking one step to the left instead of one step to the right. And there's no way to extract meaning or purpose from that kind of death. The enemy you couldn't see, couldn't predict, couldn't defeat through any application of superior training or firepower or courage. You could clear an area of booby traps through painful systematic searching that took hours and exposed the searchers to sniper fire and ambush. And the enemy would simply seed it again the next night, replacing what you found with new threats in new locations that required the entire process to begin again. You could avoid known dangerous areas, but that meant ceding terrain and limiting your operational freedom and accepting that the enemy controlled ground through presence of threats rather than presence of forces. You could develop elaborate procedures and careful protocols for movement through hostile areas. And sometimes those procedures helped, and sometimes they didn't, because the enemy adapted faster than doctrine could be updated, inventing new types of traps and new methods of concealment that rendered existing countermeasures obsolete. Only endure. That's what it came down to, the understanding that this particular aspect of the war had no solution, no decisive action that would eliminate the threat. Nothing to do except accept that some percentage of your people would be killed or maimed by traps, and the only response available was to endure the losses and continue mission and try not to Let the constant fear drive you completely insane, and this is how months of this rewires the brain, fundamentally changes your neurology in ways that persist long after you leave the environment that created them. Sleep becomes dangerous because your subconscious can't distinguish past from present, can't understand that you're in a safe place where threats don't exist. Every night becomes another patrol. Dreams placing you back in the jungle where you must maintain vigilance even while asleep, where rest never comes because some part of your mind remains on watch, regardless of what your conscious will desires. You wake dozens of times each night, jerking alert at sounds that shouldn't be threatening, but trigger threat responses anyway because the associations were burned too deep to be reasoned away. Silence becomes threatening in ways that make no sense to people who haven't experienced what you experienced. Because in the jungle, silence meant something was wrong, meant that nature had detected danger and gone quiet in response. And now, normal quiet in safe environments makes your heart race and your hands sweat, and your mind spin through threat assessments, even when rational thought insists there's nothing to fear. And normalcy, the ability to exist in peaceful environment without constant threat monitoring, becomes unreachable despite desperate desire to reclaim it. You can't sit with your back to a door because that position leaves you vulnerable to threats from behind. Can't relax in crowds because too many people means too many potential threats to track. Can't walk without scanning for disturbances in the ground, even though the sidewalks of American cities don't hide punji stakes or pressure plates. The responses that kept you alive in Vietnam become disabilities in peacetime, reflexes that no longer serve useful purpose but persist anyway because the brain doesn't easily unlearn patterns that were reinforced through life or death stakes. And so you remain trapped in a combat mindset long after the combat has ended. A prisoner of your own survival instincts that won't accept that the war is over. Landing stateside carries weight that's impossible to explain to anyone who hasn't experienced it. The surreal transition from environment, where death is constant possibility, to environment where people complain about traffic and worry about promotions and lives so far removed from combat that they might as well be different. Species, home, freedom, safety, the words that should mean everything, that sustained you through the worst moments of your tour. Except it doesn't feel like any of those things when you finally arrive. The plane touches down on American soil and you should feel relief, should feel joy, should feel something other than the strange numbness that settles over you as you realize that while your body has returned, something essential has been left behind in ways you don't yet understand but will spend years discovering. Your body returned. That much is undeniably true in the most literal physical sense. You can touch American soil and breathe American air and see American faces, but pieces of your soul stayed in those jungles forever. They're still there at Firebase Charlie, still in the kill zone at November 7, still walking point on patrols that never end, still making choices that can't be unmade, and watching friends die deaths that can't be prevented. You carry Vietnam in your body through muscle memory and conditioned responses. Carry it in your mind through memories that intrude without warning. Carry it in your soul through guilt and grief and the fundamental alteration of who you are that no amount of time or distance can fully reverse. No parades, no gratitude, only judgment. Protesters spitting on the uniform you bled in, being called baby killer by people who knew nothing about what you did or didn't do, who based their judgment on images from television and the assumption that everyone who served in Vietnam must have committed atrocities. So you hide it, make the calculated decision that openness about your service brings more pain than it relieves. The uniform goes into the closet, pushed to the back behind civilian clothes, never to wear again. Awards and decorations get hidden in drawers. Physical evidence of service. That brings no pride because the culture has decided that pride in military service from this particular war is inappropriate. Trying to explain Vietnam to people who watched it on TV represents an exercise in futility that you attempt anyway because the need to be understood is fundamental to human nature. At family gatherings, you sit silent and separate, unable to participate in conversations that feel trivial beyond measure. The unbridgeable gap between experience and observation, between living through war and consuming it as entertainment between commercials, makes meaningful communication nearly impossible. They think they know because they saw the footage and read the articles and have opinions. But they don't know the smell or the weight or the sound or the fear or the love or the cost. And you realize that they never will. The gap is unbridgeable, not because they're stupid or uncaring, but because some experiences cannot be transmitted through language, cannot be reduced to stories that would make sense to someone standing outside them. Survivor's guilt becomes the second war, the conflict that begins the moment you realize you made it home when better men didn't. Why did I make it when better men didn't? The question has no answer because survival in combat is rarely about being better or deserving, but rather about luck and timing and random distribution of death. The friends who had families waiting, the guys with fiancés who died months before weddings they'd never see, the ones who had dreams about futures they'd never experience. They're gone, and you're here, and it makes no sense, refuses to resolve into any pattern that would allow acceptance or peace. There's no logic to who survived and who didn't. No justice in the distribution of death, no reason beyond meaningless physics of ballistics and explosives. The invisible wounds last longer than physical scars. Hypervigilance that made sense in combat becomes disability in civilian life. The constant scanning for threats becoming exhausting when threats don't actually exist. Emotional numbness that protected you from being overwhelmed by grief and fear persists when those protections are no longer needed, leaving you unable to feel joy or connection with the intensity that relationships require. How do you care about quarterly reports when you've held your friend while he died? How do you get excited about promotions when you've called in airstrikes on your own position? You don't. You just pretend, construct elaborate performances of normalcy that allow you to navigate civilian life without anyone noticing how fundamentally broken you are inside. And the pretending becomes its own kind of war, requiring constant energy to maintain the facade of being fine when nothing is fine and maybe never will be fine again. What no one told them, what became undeniable truth that contradicted every expectation about what coming home would mean. Coming home doesn't end the war. It just changes the battlefield to your own mind, moves the conflict from external terrain to internal terrain that has no maps and no weapons effective against the enemies you face. The nightmares that replay firefights and deaths, the flashbacks triggered by sounds or smells that shouldn't be threatening, but connect to memories so powerfully that for moments you're back in Vietnam. The rage that comes from nowhere, the isolation from being unable to connect with anyone who wasn't there. The war never ends for those who fought it. It just continues in different form, fought not with weapons, but with desperate attempts to remember who you were before Vietnam changed you into someone else. Coming home was supposed to be the end, but it turned out to be just another beginning, the start of a different kind of combat that would last the rest of their lives. Vietnam didn't break these men because they were weak. It broke them because they were human, asked to do impossible things with impossible rules in an impossible war. They were asked to fight without clear objectives, to distinguish between enemies and civilians when the distinction was deliberately obscured, to measure success by body counts that incentivized killing regardless of whether those killed were actually combatants. They were given rules that prioritized political considerations over tactical reality, that changed with such frequency that staying compliant became nearly impossible. Human beings break under those conditions not because they're defective, but because those conditions are designed to break people. Stephen E. Ambrose reminded us through his extensive documentation of World War II that at the core of every soldier is a simple need a fundamental human requirement that transcends nationality and ideology. To come home with honor, not glory necessarily, not parades or medals, but honor, the internal sense that you served with dignity, that you maintained your humanity even in the most dehumanizing circumstances imaginable. But Vietnam denied them even that basic dignity upon return, denied it through protests and contempt and national amnesia that wanted to forget the war and everyone associated with it as quickly as possible. They came home looking for acknowledgement that their service meant something, that their sacrifices weren't wasted. Instead, they found rejection and the message that their service was something to hide rather than honor. Tim O'Brien, who carried the jungle home in his words with precision that makes reading his work painful for anyone who was there, wrote something that cuts to the essential nature of what Vietnam was. A true war story is never moral. It does not instruct nor encourage virtue. If a story seems moral, do not believe it, because real war exists in spaces where morality breaks down, where men are forced to make choices that have no good options and live with consequences that admit no easy absolution. Vietnam taught this truth in blood, wrote it across the bodies of 58,000 Americans and millions of Vietnamese, inscribed it into the psyches of everyone who survived with scars that never quite healed. The fall was inevitable, not because they failed, but because the mission itself was compromised from the beginning, compromised by political leaders who committed to war without understanding what victory would require, compromised by strategic thinking that assumed American firepower could overcome enemy will, compromised by domestic politics that prevented total commitment while demanding results that partial commitment could never achieve. The warriors didn't fail. They won virtually every battle they fought. But tactical success couldn't overcome strategic incoherence, and individual bravery couldn't compensate for systemic failures at levels far above where soldiers operated. Yet within that fall, something remained unbroken. The brotherhood forged in combat, those bonds between men who shared the worst experiences imaginable and came through together. The loyalty that made men risk death to save friends. The willingness to sacrifice for the man beside you. These things survived because they were real in ways that strategic objectives and political rhetoric never were. Because they emerged from actual experience. Because they represented human connection at its most essential. You can lose faith in country and mission and the justness of the cause. But you can't lose the memory of the men who stood with you, can't deny the reality of what you shared. These warriors didn't choose this war. Vietnam chose them, but they chose each other, made conscious decisions every day to prioritize their brothers' welfare over their own safety, to stay loyal when loyalty demanded everything. And that choice echoes through eternity, resonates forward through decades in ways that those who made it couldn't have predicted. The choice to be worthy of the men beside you. The choice to carry forward the memory of those who didn't make it home. The choice to help other veterans struggling with the same demons. These choices represent the fire within that survived the fall. The spark of humanity that couldn't be extinguished no matter how dark things got. We honor them not by glorifying what they endured, not by pretending that war is noble or that suffering builds character. Glorification serves no one except those who never experienced combat. We honor them by never forgetting what it cost them to endure it, by acknowledging the price they paid in blood and sanity and innocence, by refusing to let their sacrifices disappear into historical amnesia. By listening when they're willing to talk and respecting their silence when they're not. By understanding that the men who fought didn't make the war and don't bear responsibility for its failures, that they deserve respect for their service, even if the war itself deserves criticism. The fall happened. The breaking was real. The costs were catastrophic, but so was the courage. So was the brotherhood. So was the determination to maintain humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it. And in remembering all of it, the bitter and the noble together, we honor not the war, but the warriors, not the policy, but the people. Not what they were sent to do, but who they remained, despite everything they endured.